ميزاجور. المهم اللي قبل غادي يعرف كيفاش غيدير. غادي تمشيو لتحت، غتحوسوا على فاست اكتيفيت، لوج على فاست اكتيفيت، ومن بعد لونسيها كوم ادمينستراتور. ايوا تسنى شويه. اوكي غيجيك هاد لاباج هادي، تمشيو لا دوزيام باتش، هاديك لا دوزيام تضغط عليها هادي باش تاكتيفي لا كارت. فوالا دونك لا كارت ديال اوروبا وتونس اكتيفات. من بعد غادي ترجعوا نباتشيو النافكور، لان اوبليجي السيستيم تا هو نباتشيوه باش يخدم نتاع الجي بي اس. هذا بارفوا كيطول شويه، بارفوا سي رابيد، سا ديبون على لا فيتاس نتاع الجي بي اس نتاعكم. هاد الجي بي اس نتاع السيد اللي جابوه لي باش يروح لتونس شويه ثقيل، مي بون سا مارش يا با بروبليم. ليسونسييل حنا قالك اللي زربو ماتوا، حنا ما نزربوش، نستناو. فوالا على كل حال تونس من بعد غنحط. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. اليوم غادي نوريكم الطريقة باش نديرو لا ميزاجور لا كارت نتاع لا تونيزي ان شاء الله، من بعد ما غتحطوها في لاغاسي نتاع الجي بي اس نتاعكم. المهم اللي اول مرة غيشوف لا فيديو غيشوف لي فيديو اللي قبل غادي يعرف كيفاش غيدير. غادي تمشيو لتحت، غتحوسوا على فاست اكتيفيت، لوج على فاست اكتيفيت، ومن بعد لونسيها كوم ادمينستراتور. ايوا تسنى شويه. اوكي غيجيك هاد لاباج هادي، تمشيو لا دوزيام باتش، هاديك لا دوزيام.
Hello everyone, this is Ali here again. Today we're talking about updating your sat-nav navigation or TomTom or whatever function. Then 7 MB, which is far enough good. And if you don't have enough space into it, the other option is to put a SD card into your TomTom. Let me show you if I've got somewhere here. There we go. This one is the different model one. This is the newest model. It's supposed the SD card where I've got it at the bottom here. There we go. 8 GB of TomTom SD card. So you put it there, and you have more space and storage, and you can just download and install on the SD card. And if your TomTom doesn't support like this one, SD card slot, you would need to delete the main map, the older version map from your TomTom, which already has been deleted from there. But I'll show you how we do this application. You take it and you just remove the item from the device. There you go. So once you've done that, you're good to go. You come back here, and there are certain things you can back up your TomTom. If you want to back up, you can back up your TomTom. Just click here and back it up to your computer. In case anything goes wrong, you can come back and restore onto your TomTom. So we go next. So here's the update my TomTom. Oh, there we go. We got nice updates here, as well as we got I'm just seeing where are these updates. There we go. So we can just update and install. Okay, wait a second, need to go back. If you want to update, if you want to put all these camera speed updates, you can just tick them. Austria, that's, you know, entirely up to you. Denmark. If you ever think that you're going to these countries, that you probably need to update it, because you will have a updated version of a speed camera alert. So Sweden, UK and Sweden, there you go. So just update and install. So it's saying here that backup your navigation device first, and then install it. Do you want to backup, or do you want to not backup, skip for now, and that will just go through the update. And there we go. It will take certain minutes, or it would take a while. Done. But you would need to this is how you do the updates on your TomTom. If you need more cameras, you can just get more cameras. If you don't need, just leave it, and there we go. Done. So guys, this is how you do the updates on your TomTom. If you got any question, please mark it, send it to me, and I'll try my best to answer you. Thank you very much, guys. Have a nice day.
Hello and welcome back to another PC build. So this is going to be another full PC build guide. So I'm going to be going through all the steps you need to put all the parts you can see in front of me together. We're then going to be going on and installing Windows and any necessary drivers you're going to need to get your PC up and going, and any additional steps then that you're going to need to do. I'm going to be showing you how to do it. So if you watch this video, you're going to be able to put all these parts from bean parts into a fully working PC. So if you've never built a PC before, you've come to the right place. So the first thing I want to do is go through the parts I've chosen for the PC today. And this is probably a mid-range to high mid-range PC. It's certainly going to have no issues running any games, and it's going to be very comfortable for video editing. So let's have a look at the parts. Okay, for the case, I've decided to go with the Pure Base 500DX from BQuat, and I've already done a high-end build in this case and a lot of thermal testing and a full case review. So you're thinking of getting this case, it's worth checking that out. And a spoiler alert, I was really impressed with this case. It performed really well thermally, and at the moment this is my case of the year so far. So that's the reason I've chosen it for today's build. With the B550 motherboards having just been released, I've decided to go with the B550 Tomahawk for this build. In my opinion, it's one of the best looking B550 motherboards, and we've already had some reviews of it and it's performed really well. So one of the main advantages a B550 motherboard is going to give you over a B450 is access to some of the fast PCIe Gen 4 SSDs. So if that's something you're not interested in, you might want to think about the B450 Tomahawk. So I'm going to put a link to it in the description as well. Likewise, if you're going to want to use more than one of the PCIe Gen 4 SSDs, you might want to think about X570. So I'm going to put a link to the X570 motherboard as another option for this build as well. For the CPU, I've decided to go with the Ryzen 7 3700X. So this is an 8-core CPU, and it won't have any difficulty with gaming or video editing. If you don't need the extra 2 cores, I'll put a link to some 6-core CPUs, which will be perfectly fine for gaming, in the description. So keeping our CPU cool, I've decided to go with the Dark Rock Pro 4 CPU cooler from BQuat. So this is their top of the line CPU cooler, and shouldn't have any problems at all keeping our 3700X cool under load. If you don't want to spend this amount of money on a CPU cooler, the Pure Rock 2 in black I think would look particularly well in this case. So again, I'll put a link to that in the description as a cheaper option. And again, if you don't want to spend any extra money on a CPU cooler, you can of course use the stock CPU cooler that comes with a 3700X. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to install that as well. For the RAM, I've got 16 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro in black at 3200 MHz speed. So I've used this RAM kit before in a number of builds and never had any issues with it. For the GPU, I've decided to go with an NVIDIA 2070 Super. So this is a very capable GPU and a perfect balance between price and performance. You'll get some great gaming performance from it, and it's also very capable for video editing. So I use a 2070 Super in my second rig, and unless I had it right beside my main rig, which is a 2080 Ti in it, I can't really notice any difference. So a great choice for the graphics card. So as I already mentioned, one of the main reasons for going B550 is to take advantage of the fast PCIe Gen 4 SSDs. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We've got a Sabrent Rocket Gen 4 SSD, 500 gigabytes to use as our main boot drive for this build. So as well as the M.2 SSD from Sabrent, I've also picked up two 500 gigabyte SATA SSDs, and these are the KC600 from Kingston. And some of you may well be wondering, if I wanted 1 terabyte of additional storage, why didn't I just go with a single SSD? And the reason for that is in the PureBase 500DX, they have an SSD mount on the front of the case, and it has space for two SSDs. And I think just having a single 1 terabyte SSD here is going to look asymmetrical. And in fact, the two 500 gigabyte models were priced fairly similarly to a 1 terabyte model. So it's going to give us the same storage, but look slightly better. Powering the whole build, I've gone with a 550 watt gold semi-modular power supply from Corsair, and it's the TX550M model, and this should be enough power for what we've got in front of us here. So the PureBase 500DX comes with 3 PureWings 2 fans already included, and in my previous case review and thermal testing, I've found that the 3 included fans perform really well. So if you don't want to put any additional fans into this build, there's no need to. However, there is space for an additional 3 120mm fans or 2 140mm fans, and as the PureWings 2 fans are reasonably cheap, I've picked up an additional 2 140mm fans. So the additional 2 fans that I've picked up are optional. You don't need to go for these if you don't want to, and your build will look good and run reasonably cool. However, if you want to improve your temperatures a little bit more, and I also think make your build look slightly better, because I think when you occupy all the fan slots, things do look better. For very little additional cost, I would recommend picking up these additional 2 fans given their low price. And the last 2 items that I've picked up are also optional. So there's some cable extensions. So I've got a set of black and white cable extensions from Cable Mod. I've used these in a number of builds before, and these are purely aesthetic. They're not going to add any additional performance to your build. You don't need them at all, but they will make your build look better. So it's up to you to decide whether you want to add these in or not. Okay, so the final item I've picked up is also a cable extension, but it's for one of the front panel connecting cables, the HD audio cable. And the reason I've picked it up is the original cable that comes with the case has lots of multicolored wires coming from it, and it's going to be on full display at the bottom of your case. And it's going to really, I think, detract from what is otherwise a great looking build. And in fact, when I reviewed the PureBase 500DX, this was really my only negative to the case. So picking up this little cable extension is going to solve this problem for you. Okay, so that's all the parts for the build. You'll find a part list in the description, and I'm going to include the options I've mentioned in that. So let's get on with the build. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to prepare the case. And in doing this, we want to remove any panels or dust filters that are going to get in our way during the build. So we'll start off with removing the front panel. So it's held on with 4 thumb screws, which just need to loosen. And then we should be able to lift the front glass panel out. To remove the rear panel, we just need to loosen these 2 thumb screws. And then we should be able to slide the panel to the right hand side and lift out. Okay, so we'll have a look in the hard drive cage. We've got a little box marked accessories. So this is quite often where your accessories box comes in most cases. So in here you're going to find normally a collection of screws that are going to let you secure your motherboard to the case, to secure your hard drives and SSDs, and also to secure your power supply. We also got some cable ties to help with cable management, but we can note already there's some Velcro straps to help with cable management. Okay, so I'd already mentioned this little bracket where we're going to mount our 2 SATA SSDs, so we can go ahead and remove this now by loosening this little thumb screw at the top. and the bracket should just slide out. On the top of the case there's a magnetic dust filter which just lifts out of place. Okay, to remove the front panel there's a little handle down here, and all we need to do is pull it towards ourselves. It is quite stiff, so it does need a good pull. Okay, so that's the front panel off. What you'll notice when you look at the front panel is there's these 3 metal pins, and you've also got 3 metal connectors here. So that's one of the nice things about this case. Although this case does have RGB in the front panel, there's no wires actually holding it on. So removing the front panel after your build is fairly straightforward. Okay, in the front of the case we've got a dust filter. All we need to do is pull this bit to the side and it should lift out. Okay, so as I already mentioned, this case comes with 3 Pure Wings 2 fans already installed. So we've got one at the front, one at the top, and one at the rear of the case. Now, certainly the one at the top and the one at the rear of the case are going to get in the way when we're fitting our motherboard and trying to feed wires in from the back and into the sockets on the motherboard. The one in the front probably won't cause us any problems, but I do like to remove all the fans at the start to make the build a bit easier. So each fan is held on with 4 screws, so we just need to loosen these and then we'll be able to get the fans out. Okay, that's the case ready to go. Next thing is to move on to the motherboard. Okay, so this is our Tomahawk B550 motherboard. So we want to do as much as we can with the motherboard outside the case before we install the motherboard into the case, because working it on the flat table is much easier than working in the tight and closed spaces of a case. So we're going to go ahead and install the CPU into the socket here. We're going to put our M.2 SSD into this socket here, and we're going to put our RAM into here, all before we put the motherboard into the case. As well, we're actually going to go ahead and put our CPU cooler onto the motherboard first, and then put the motherboard into the case. So the first thing we want to do is install our CPU, which is going to go into this socket here in the middle of the motherboard. So to prepare the motherboard to receive the CPU, all we need to do is lift this retention clip all the way over to the right hand side. Okay, so this is our CPU, and what you'll notice is I'm holding the CPU by its sides, and the reason for that is I don't want to damage these gold pins that are on the bottom of the CPU. So if I was to touch the bottom of the gold pins, I could bend them, making our CPU absolutely useless. So when you take it out of the plastic packaging, make sure you hold it by the sides so you don't damage the little gold pins on the bottom. One of the other things I want you to notice about the CPU is if you look at the bottom left hand corner, there's a little gold marking on it. None of the other corners on the CPU have this marking, so this is going to be important when we put the CPU in the socket. We're going to want to line this marking up with the marking on the socket, so we put the CPU in the right way round. Okay, so we'll take a closer look at the CPU socket, and what you'll notice on this corner here, there's a little triangle on the corner of the socket, and there's also a little white mark on the motherboard itself. So this is where we're going to have to line up the mark on the CPU, so we orientate the CPU in the socket the right way round. Okay, so I've got the CPU, I've got the mark here lined up with the mark on the socket. So to install it in the socket, all I want to do is hover over the socket and let the CPU fall into the socket. It's really important I don't go pressing down on the CPU because I'm going to bend the pins if it's not lined up properly. So you notice there the CPU just dropped into place, and if it doesn't, you just want to move it around a little bit till it falls into place. But don't be tempted to push it in, because all you're going to do there is damage your pins. Okay, so to secure the CPU in the socket, all we need to do is close this little lever. And we've now installed our CPU. Okay, so the next thing for us to do is install our M.2 SSD. And this motherboard has 2 M.2 SSD sockets. So we've got one here and one here, and both these sockets have heat sinks on them to help keep the SSDs cool when they're running. Importantly, only the one at the top supports Gen 4 speeds. The one at the bottom only will go up to a maximum of Gen 3 speed. Now, even if you have a Gen 3 SSD, you're much better putting it in to the top socket. As we've got a Gen 4 SSD, we're going to install it into this socket. So we need to remove these two little screws here to remove the heatsink and expose the socket. Okay, so now I should just be able to lift the heatsink off. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the socket. So this bit here is actually where our M.2 SSD is going to plug in, and this is the little standoff that's going to hold it in place. Normally in the motherboard box you're going to have a little screw, which is then going to screw into the standoff and secure the M.2 SSD. And what you'll notice, there's empty places here, so we're able to move these little standoffs along so they're in the right place for our SSD. So the first thing for us to look is to check and see, are these standoffs in the right place? So this is our SSD, and if we line it up with the socket, we're going to be able to screw it in here. So this one is in the right place for us. Okay, to install the SSD, all we need to do is insert it at a slight angle into the socket. Then when we lower it down, we're going to be able to screw it into place. Okay, so we've got a little screw here that comes with our motherboard, and we just line it up with the socket. And then we should be able to screw things into place. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is just put the heatsink back on, but before we do that, there's just a little layer of plastic that we need to remove. Okay, that's the M.2 SSD installed. Next thing to do is install the RAM. Okay, so the RAM is going to go into these sockets over here on the right hand side of the motherboard. What you'll notice is there's 4 RAM slots, but the kit of RAM that we got only came with 2 RAM sticks. So we can't just pick or choose which of these sockets we insert them into. And if you look in the motherboard manual, it recommends that you install, if you've got 2 sticks of RAM, into the second socket away from the CPU and the 4th socket away from the CPU first, if you've only got the 2 sticks of RAM. Okay, so this is also marked on the motherboard for us here. It's saying if we've only 2 sticks, the first we should be installing it in here and here. Okay, so this is our RAM, and one of the things I want you to notice is that the gold connectors that are going to plug into the motherboard are at the bottom, but they're not of equal lengths. So the one over the right hand side is longer than the one over the left hand side. So it's important we line this up properly when we're plugging it in to the socket. Okay, so to prepare the motherboard to receive the RAM, all we need to open is the little clips on each of the sockets that we're going to be inserting the RAM into. Next we need to line the RAM up with the socket, making sure we've got the long side on the long side of the socket. And if we just line it up in the socket, checking it's the right way round, and then all we need to do is apply some firm pressure and it should lock and click into place. Now it's just a matter of repeating the process with the second stick of RAM. So if we line it up with the socket and then apply a bit of pressure, and it locks and clicks into place. So we've now installed the RAM. Okay, the next thing for us to do is install the CPU cooler. And although I'm using the Darkrock Pro 4 for this build, I did mention I would show you how to use the stock AMD cooler that comes with our 3700X. So let's take a closer look at this cooler. Okay, so really all this cooler is, it's a fan on top of a heatsink. So this is what's going to keep our CPU cool. Importantly, down the bottom of the CPU cooler, we've got thermal paste pre-applied. So we're not going to have to add any additional thermal paste. But we need to be really careful we don't damage the pre-applied thermal paste, so don't be touching this at all or letting it rub off on anything else during the build process. Next thing to do is, how is this going to clip onto our motherboard? It's going to use these little clips onto the clips that are on the motherboard. Also coming off the CPU cooler, we've got a 4-pin fan connector which we're going to plug into our CPU fan header on the motherboard. And if we have a look over at the side of the CPU cooler, we've got some little sockets here. So if we pull this clip off, so we've got a 4-pin and also a 3-pin socket here. And this comes with 2 different cables. So we've got one which is a standard 12-volt RGB cable, which is going to plug into your 12-volt RGB header on your motherboard. And it has the 4 little sockets, so it's going to plug into here. So that's it, plugged in. If you want to control the RGB on this cooler with the 4-pin header on your motherboard and use it with the motherboard software. So the other option that we have is there's also a USB cable supplied. And if we look at the end of it, it's got the 3 pins, so it's going to plug in over this side here. On the other end of the cable, we've got a USB plug, and we're going to need to plug this into one of the USB 2.0 headers on our motherboard. We're then going to have to download software, and I'll put links to that in the description, and then we can use that software to control the RGB lighting on the cooler. So importantly, you don't want to use both of these, you want to use one or the other. Okay, so to install the cooler, we want to lower it down and then line this little clip up with the socket here. Okay, so that side's locked in. Okay, so now all we need to do is line this little clip up on the other side, so we just put a little bit of pressure on it and push in, so that's now locked into place. Okay, now to secure the cooler, all we're going to have to do is lift this lever all the way over to the other side. Okay, so that's now locked into place and the CPU cooler is nice and secure. In fact, we can actually lift it up with the cooler. Okay, so the next thing for us to do is to plug the cable, which is going to allow the fan, the power to spin round, but also allow our motherboard to adjust the speed of the fan depending on how hot the CPU is. So we're going to plug it into the CPU fan header, which is this little 4-pin connector here, and it's marked here, CPU fan. Okay, if we look closely at the fan header, we'll notice there's a little bit of plastic over this side, and the little connector here has 2 little bits of plastic on it as well. So these need to line up. So we line them up on this side, and then just push, and it should lock into place. Now the only other thing, we don't want to leave this cable here looking untidily, so we're just going to tuck it in out of the way and make things look a little bit more tidy. Okay, so at the moment, if we were to plug this in, our CPU cooler would work, it would have power, and the motherboard would be able to control the speed of the fan, but we wouldn't have any way to control the RGB. And as we've mentioned, there's 2 ways of doing this. We can either use USB with a separate software, or we can use a 12-volt 4-pin RGB header on the motherboard and allow us to use our motherboard software to control the RGB. So I'll show you both of these. So if we're going to use the USB one, first of all, we're going to plug into the 3-pin connector on the bottom of the cooler. So we'll plug that in. Okay, so that's now secure and in place. So ideally with this cable, you would want to route it back around the motherboard, out of the way, and then we've got our USB headers, the 2.0 headers down the bottom of the motherboard. If we look at this pin, there's 1 hole missing here, and there's 1 pin missing here, so we have to line it up the right way. And then all we need to do, once it's lined up, is just a matter of pushing it in. Ideally, like I said, this cable is going to be coming out the back of the motherboard, coming round and coming back in down the bottom, so it's not going to run on the front of your motherboard. And I'll put a link in the description to the software that you're going to need to use this with if you are going to go down this route. Okay, so the other way that we can control lighting on the CPU killer is to use one of the 4-pin 12-volt non-addressable RGB headers on our motherboard. And our motherboard has two, so there is one here and one here. And this would be the method I would recommend if you're planning on using the stock CPU killer. And the reason for that is our motherboard has RGB on it, so we're going to have to download MSI's RGB software to allow us to control the lighting on the motherboard. It's also going to let us control the lighting on the RAM and let us control the lighting on the CPU killer as long as we plug it into one of these headers. So for me, it just makes sense to use the one RGB software rather than two different softwares. So like I say, if you're going to go down this route, this would be the method I would recommend. Okay, so before I come on to show you how to plug everything in, there's a couple of things I want to mention about RGB headers on motherboards. So there's two different types of RGB headers. The one we're going to use, as we mentioned, is a 4-pin 12-volt non-addressable RGB header. This motherboard also has a different type of RGB header. There's 3-pin addressable 5-volt RGB headers as well. So we've got one here, and there's also another 3-pin one, I think. Yes, there it is, up the top of the motherboard. So these are not interchangeable. If your hardware requires a 4-pin 12-volt non-addressable header and you plug it into the addressable header, you're actually going to damage your hardware. So you have to be really, really careful here. So we're going to have to use one of the 4-pin headers, and they cannot be used interchangeably. Okay, so what we want to do is plug the cable into the bottom of the CPU killer. And then we're going to need to plug the other end of the wire into one of the 4-pin headers on our motherboard. So as I've already mentioned to you, this cable is going to be routed around the back of the motherboard and back in once it's in the case. So we're going to use this 4-pin header here. Okay, so if I get you a close-up look at this cable, what you'll notice, this pin over the left-hand side has a little arrow on it, and that is to highlight the 12-volt pin. So it's important it's lined up with a 12-volt pin on the motherboard. If we have a look at the motherboard, what we will notice that our 12-volt pin is the one all the way over to the left-hand side. So if we line our cable up with that, then all we need to do is push, and it will lock into place. Okay, so that's the stock CPU killer installed, and we would now be able to use our motherboard's RGB software not only to control the lighting on the motherboard itself, the RAM, but also the CPU killer. Okay, so the first step in installing the DarkRock Pro 4 is to remove these brackets from the motherboard. So we just need to loosen each of these 4 screws. And then we should be able to just lift the brackets off. So importantly, don't throw these out, put them into your motherboard box. So you ever come to change your CPU killer in the future or to sell your motherboard, you're not going to have to go searching for them. Okay, so the first thing we're going to have to do is put the mounting brackets onto the stock motherboard backplate. So in the cooler package itself, you get one labelled AMD, so that's the packaging we're going to have to open. One of the other nice things you get in the box with the CPU cooler is a magnetic screwdriver. So I've been using this for the build so far, and having the magnetic tip on the screwdriver makes it much easier for managing any screws. So I'd recommend you open the box right at the start of your build and get the screwdriver out. Okay, so we need to put these little spacers over the back plate. And in our little bracket, it has 2 holes on each side. One of them is labelled AM4, which is the one on the top, so we're going to put the screws through the AM4 marked place on the socket and line them up then with the spacers. And then all we need to do is screw that into place. Okay, just the same process on the top then. Okay, so we've got the screws in through the holes labelled AM4 because this is an AM4 socket that we have. And then just screw things into place. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is add some thermal paste to the CPU. And if you look online, there's a whole variety of different ways people do this. Everyone has their own reason of why their way is best. I prefer just to put a pea-sized amount in the middle of the CPU, and then when the cooler is applied, that will squash the paste out and cover the whole of the CPU. So thermal paste comes with the cooler in a little syringe, so all we need to do is squeeze a little bit out into the middle of the CPU. Okay, so that looks about right to me. Okay, so the next thing is just to line up the CPU cooler with the bracket. Importantly, don't forget to remove the plastic sticker from the bottom of the CPU cooler. Okay, so we need to make sure the Be Quiet logo is the right way up, and then it's just a matter of aligning this with the centre of the socket. Next, we want to align this little metal bracket up with the CPU cooler. So it just goes in through the middle, and then if we line the holes up. Now we need to put two screws, one down here and one at the back, to secure the cooler to the motherboard. The problem is we need to get the screwdriver in through holes on top of the cooler, so we're going to have to remove these two little bits from the top of the cooler. This is just unscrew. Okay, so importantly at the top, we're able to fit the screwdriver through the hole, but not the screw. So what we need to do is line the screw up here, feed the screwdriver through, and then pass the screw into the screwdriver. And then we are able to line the holes up at the bottom and secure things in place. So I'm just going to loosely tighten that one and then repeat the same process with the one at the back. Okay, so I'm just going to alternate, tightening each of these up a little bit at a time, because obviously you don't want to tighten one up and then not have the other one tightened. So it's going to pull the cooler one way on the socket. So a couple of turns of each at a time. Okay, so that's that back one fully screwed in. And now the front one is fully screwed in as well. Okay, to finish off, all we need to do is screw these little caps at the top back in again. Okay, so that's the heatsink onto the motherboard. The next thing to do is insert the fans onto the heatsink. And this CPU cooler comes with two different fans. We've got a 135mm fan to go into the middle between the two towers. And we've got also a 120mm fan which goes on this side of the tower. It's smaller because it means it's not going to get caught on the RAM itself. So before we put the fans on, it's important to talk a little bit about airflow through fans. So fans have a front and a back. So this is the front of the fan. You can see it's got the logo and it doesn't have any bits of plastic blocking the fan. On the back you tend to have these bits of plastic and the fan looks clearly to be the wrong way round. So with a fan, air is going to come in through the front and out the back. So it's important we install these fans on the heatsink the way we want air to come through the case. So when we go on to look at our case, air is going to come in through the front of the case, which is going to be the right hand side. We want it to go through the heatsink and then out the back of the case, which is going to be the left hand side over here. So it's important when we put our fans onto the heatsink, we want the front of the fan at the right hand side and the back of the fan at the left hand side. So it's going to be pushing cool air coming into the case through the heatsink and then out the back of our case. The other thing to mention is we are going to have two different fans on the CPU cooler, but we have only one CPU fan header on our motherboard. So they supply you a little kit with a fan splitter on it. So it's got one 4-pin connector on the front and two little 4-pin adapters. So both our fans are going to be able to be controlled by the motherboard and spin at the same speed. So I'm going to plug this in right at the start, because I find it makes things a little bit easier. So the other thing we're going to have to be careful with is the amount of cable and where the cable comes out. So I would like the cable to be cut. The CPU header is at the top of the motherboard, so I would like most of the cable to be hidden and only a little bit to come out the top. So I'm going to have the fan installed with the cable wrapped around here, and only this little top. So I'm going to have the fan installed with the cable wrapped around here, and only this little top. So I'm going to have the fan installed with the cable wrapped around here, and only this little bit at the top is going to come out. It's going to make things much tighter at the top. So I'm going to have the fan installed with the cable wrapped around here, and only this little bit at the top is going to come out. It's going to make things much tidier. It's going to make things much tidier. Okay, so to secure the fan. Okay, so to secure the fan. Okay, so to secure the fans to the heatsink, Okay, so to secure the fans to the heatsink, go in the same way, these little metal clips with the front of the until they clip in and lock in place, and then we just do this. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is put our motherboard into the case, but I want to have a look at the back of the case first of all. So you'll notice there's these little standoffs, there's 9 of them. A little code here which says holes A1 to A9 are for ATX motherboards, and all the standoffs at the moment are in where you're going to pass a screw in through the motherboard